Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of the origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and Media Vision. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Lee Hall, a vertebrate paleontologist at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Although he has worked on many subjects, his research now focuses on two main groups of fossils, a group of huge armored fish that includes the famous Dunkleosteus, and the phylogenetics and functional morphology of dinosaurs. And tonight, he's going to talk to us about underfoot ancient giants tracking sauropod dinosaurs. Please join me in welcoming Lee Hall.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Yeah. All right. I like to enunciate clearly. It makes everybody's night a little easier when you're learning something new. So thank you first to Glenn and Patricia for the invite to be part of this wonderful series here at Case Western, and thanks to the ISO for having me as well. And we're just going to jump right in. Can I get a show of hands first? Who was here for my last presentation in October? Oh, it's fantastic. Well, if you weren't, don't worry. I'm going to do a little bit of backpedaling so we can refresh our brains in case you all didn't spend every day studying dinosaur feet between now and then. I didn't, I'll just be honest. Before I get right into the dinosaurs, this past Sunday, November 24th, was the 160th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which I think is really cool. So I'd just like to take a moment to note that. And there you can see one of Darwin's most famous little notebook sketches there, an early phylogenetic tree with the words "I think" written at the top. That's very profound. Also, November 24th was my wife Ashley's birthday, who was a co-author on this research, so happy birthday, Ashley. And one more side note before we jump in. Thanksgiving is coming up, and turkeys are dinosaurs, so this is appropriate to mention. So Meleagris galapavo, almost our national symbol. I just think it's really fun to point out and remind people that they will be carving into a dinosaur. And so when you pull out that drumstick or that wishbone, you know, the history of those things goes pretty deep in the family tree. And if you didn't know this, when you break down the etymology of the scientific name for turkey, it basically equates to guinea, fowl, rooster, peacock. And there's reasons for that, but you can look that up, but I just thought that was kind of a neat aside. Finally, if turkeys went extinct with the dinosaurs and all we had were their bones, this is my attempt to sketch what modern artists would reconstruct a turkey to look like. There you go, quite ferocious. You always see dinosaurs running forward, jaws agape, looking vicious. We'll never know. They're still alive, so we know they're actually quite regal and maybe doofy looking. Okay, so I can't go forward without acknowledging the co-authors in this study, Dr. Denver Fowler on the left and Ms. Ashley Hall on the right, and they were both crucial to assuring that especially this phase of the research went through and was completed successfully. And then about myself, I'm a preparator, so I specialize in a subfield of paleontology that involves conservation of fossils, things like removing them from the rocks and gluing them back together and getting them ready for display, et cetera, et cetera. So jumping in, last time I talked about sauropod claws and how the claws and the hind feet function, and this time we're going to be focusing on that tantalizing blue artwork at the cover of the book Dinosaur Tracks: The Next Steps. The presentation will be broken up into the first part, which is scratch-digging sauropods. The second part will be about tracks and traces, and the third part will be stepping back in time. So sauropod dinosaurs, big long-necked animals, some of the largest animals that ever walk, well, the largest animals so far to walk on the surface of the planet. Were fairly abundant in the Mesozoic, which is the slice of time there in blue, if you look at this geologic column. And they evolved at the very end of the Triassic, 200-ish million years ago and went extinct with the other non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago or so. They were a diverse group, and as you can see here, there are several skeletons. There's actually quite a bit of diversity here, even if they all have relatively long necks, but some of them got to be very big and some of them stayed rather small. Some had weird spines coming out of their vertebrae, and some of them, had relatively elevated heads, and some were actually more like, they kept their necks elevated more horizontally. So, browsers and grazers of different kinds. And when we put our scientific and artistic minds together, we essentially get something that looks like this. So here is a really nice restoration by the artist Julius Chutunier, who is a prolific paleontological illustrator, showing sauropods as what we understand them to be today, terrestrial animals. They lived on the land. Once upon a time, people thought maybe they snorkeled under swamps and they were too fat and dumb and heavy to get out of the water. And we've only managed to shake that off, it seems, in the last 20 or 30 years. I still see bad depictions of dinosaurs like this in the popular press, and it's like, okay, it's been a century, let's move it forward, people. So that's why it's good to give talks like this. So when you look at sauropods, the features of their anatomy that really capture your attention, other than the size, is definitely going to be the very long necks, the relatively small skulls at the end of those necks, and then massive hips and upright hind limbs, long tails, and interestingly enough, their feet. So we previously did research on the function of the rear foot, or the pes, in sauropod dinosaurs. You can see on the left, that's a hand, a typical sauropod hand, with that one claw is essentially the thumb claw, and they lost all the others. And in the hind foot, or the pes, they retained some claws, and actually they got quite large. And there was also a unique articular relationship, meaning when they would squeeze and flex their foot, the claws would fold down and overlap across the front of the foot like shingles on a roof, which is really interesting. And we wondered, what on earth was that for? And previous researchers had looked at it, not terribly in depth, but they looked at it and said, well, perhaps they utilize this interesting overlap for something called scratch digging, where you use those claws to just dig into the ground. And that would be good for, a number of things, perhaps, digging for water, or digging for roots for vegetation, or perhaps digging nests. And one of the other hypotheses, not necessarily mutually exclusive, was, substrate grip. So you could engage the claws into the ground. You're a big animal, you don't want to slip. If you're walking through the mud or something, maybe flexing your foot down into the mud would help you retain, your balance and your traction, so you can keep moving. And when you look at the evolutionary trends in sauropods as a group in general, what you see is a progression in the feet to what we call the hypertrophied condition in the claws. So the claws become quite large and huge shoe or shovel sized in some cases. And in the hands, we see the opposite trend. So at the top row, you can see the hands eventually lose most of the toe claws, many of the toe bones, and even in some cases, they'll lose everything except for the stubs of the knuckles. So the question we had was, if claws like that had evolved that articulation in order to hold on to the ground, and act like tread, why would you lose half of your tread? And to give you a little bit of background on the anatomy of the foot, you can compare a sauropod foot with your foot. And there you can see we have the claws, or the ungles, highlighted in yellow. So we have essentially ungles as well, but we don't have a claw core. We have this little sheath of keratin, our toenails, which are, everyone has hit a toenail on something once. And then we have the other bones highlighted there as well. So we wanted to understand more about the feet of sauropods. A lot of times sauropods are compared to elephants, but elephants didn't have, they don't have, we can still talk about them in the present tense, they don't have claws sticking out the front of their foot. They have rather blunt hooves. So we looked around and found an interesting modern analog. So, of all the animals you could compare with a sauropod, perhaps the tortoise wasn't at the front of the line, but turns out tortoises have a skeletal anatomy in their feet that's quite similar to sauropods. And this particular species, Gopherus agassizii, is a burrowing species. And so these animals will construct burrows that are several feet or several meters deep and several meters long. And of all the animals you wouldn't expect to burrow, a tortoise would certainly be one. However, the evidence is in there in the skeletal anatomy. So the two left drawings are the feet of tortoises, and on the right is the foot of a sauropod. So those claw morphologies are really similar. And even tortoises, they will take their foot and they'll flex it. Now, we know that sauropods, being 80 feet long, probably were not digging burrows to go underground with their hind legs. So what were they using those claws for? Well, tortoises will use those hind claws to excavate nests. So we wondered, is there evidence for this? Well, when you look at the nest of eggs left by a titanosaur sauropod, like the ones you see in South America, it's really interesting. It's not a circular nest, it's not above ground, it's a hole dug into the ground, but it's about the size and shape of a bathtub. And here you can see illustrations depicting the general overall morphology or shape of these nests. They're very trough-like. So our conclusions, our rough conclusions from the study is we're not falsifying the substrate grip hypothesis, but what we are saying is that there is merit to the scratch digging hypothesis. You can't dismiss it. They have an anatomical component that is capable of functioning as an excavation aid, and we have nests that are the shape of a sauropod foot, and it looks like they just took those back legs and scraped out a hollow before depositing the eggs. So essentially, what that leaves you with is a picture like this. There we are, there's our sauropod nesting ground, and there's sauropod nests. Now those nests aren't necessarily drawn accurately, but I think it's pretty clear to see that. And so what that does is it sets up part 2, okay, if everyone's all on the same page. The main takeaways from the study, the anatomy of sauropod feet forms a novel articular relationship. No other dinosaurs have feet where the claws sort of fold down and overlap across the front of the foot. If you can imagine folding a coat over your arm, that's kind of what the claws would do. It's very strange. So scratch digging as a behavior is supported by trace fossil evidence in nests and by comparing it with modern animals with similar anatomy. That's the second line of evidence. Substrate grip as a sole selection pressure for this function in the foot seems unlikely when we look at all of the legs instead of just the back legs and see that the forelimbs are losing claws in the front of in the forelimbs rather. And so the really cool thing about that is now we can look at directly testing the substrate grip hypothesis.
On the last photo you showed of the sauropod nesting site, and it showed the adults all facing outward. Is that something you guys know happened or occurred? Or is that just an example of, what is it an example of?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm glad you raised that because I forgot to mention it. So the reason all the sauropods are walking, they're going, see ya, bye. So we think that they actually did essentially lay the eggs and leave them. So they as a whole would not have been maternal or paternal. It was essentially the babies were kind of left on their own to survive and then eventually join up with the herd at some point.
Would this have been equally work by both the males and the females, or just the females do the digging?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I am not at the moment aware of an instance where we have in dinosaurs been able to tell, first of all, male from female dinosaurs, other than looking inside the bones to see if they have special calcium reserves for eggshells. So it's difficult to answer that question if you can't tell the difference between the skeletons, the sex of the skeletons. And if sauropods in their feet are anything like most of the other dinosaurs, there's probably not a difference in there. So the question is, why would you have claws in both males and females if we're up here saying that, well, the claws were useful for scratch digging? Well, there could be many things. Maybe the genes that coded for that feature, it wasn't sex dependent because having those claws wasn't, it was non-beneficial. Maybe it was helpful in some aspects of traversing the ground in some substrate conditions, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit. One interesting thing that we always thought would be cool to look at is to take tortoises and measure the claw lengths in males versus females in the burrowing species and see if the females had statistically longer claws.
Do we know whether they were digging in sandy soil, wet soil, hard packed soil?
Yeah, so the cool thing is that in their nests, you can see the stratigraphy of the sediment. So we know they dug into the ground and didn't pile up, like on top of the surface, because when you look in the sides of the nest, you can see how the feet cut through the sediment. So in some cases, you're looking at areas where they were digging in sandy soil on floodplain. And the reason we have dinosaur nest sites is because the floodplain got flooded, and so sorry for the baby dinosaurs, but we have some amazing fossils from there. But there's that's one instance. There is certainly a variety of places depending on the species, what their range would have been, and even the kinds of dinosaurs you're talking about.
So how do these dinosaurs compare to the duckbills? Because I remember decades ago, Jack Horner spoke in Cleveland, and he had a lot of evidence that the females did attend to the nests, for that group at least.
So I think this year's, I think it was the 40th anniversary of that discovery of Egg Mountain and Maiasaura peeblesorum, so a duckbill dinosaur. They discovered a massive herd, and in that particular instance, yes, you had nesting structures, and those nesting structures had crushed eggshell on the bottom, and some of them they found young fledgling individuals, and when they looked at the bones, the joints in particular were not fully ossified. So there was skeletal evidence that said that these animals needed care, and you also have evidence of sociality with animals of different ages being preserved in that area, from babies all the way through adults. So when you look at a sauropod nesting ground, you'll have instances of, had they been like Maiasaura, we'd be finding giant sauropod bones on top of these nests. But essentially what you're finding are just nests. Sometimes they'll have embryos in the eggs, but there's no indication of thousands of giant sauropods hanging out there. And I think given their size and the amount of resources that they needed, that they probably couldn't afford to spend a lot of time looking after a nest,
As an orthopedic surgeon, I'm going to challenge your genealogy. Those bones look so much like the hands and feet I've spent my career working on that I wonder if the dinosaur is a precursor of mammals rather than turkeys.
Yeah, it's always interesting the kinds of patterns that you see when you start examining, something you've never seen before. With these sauropod feet, I spent so many hours, we all did, staring at these weird claws and I built little models trying to understand the articular relationships, and after a while everything that had kind of a claw and a twist looked like a sauropod foot to me. But that's homology. That's the evidence of shared traits of terrestrial animals with 5 digits on the end of their limb. In that picture of a rock auger, I remember I was up at a site when I used to work in California watching for fossils, and they were digging for power lines, and they were boring into the ground and testing for faults, and they brought this giant drum that was the size of like a 50-gallon drum, and on the bottom of it there were all these metal pegs sticking out, and it started to spin and turn, and I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, that looks a lot like sauropod foot, and for good reason, because they're both capable of basically twisting into the sediment and moving some rock around.
Thank you for joining us. You have been watching Lee Hall, discussing how the nests of sauropod dinosaurs are similar to those of modern-day tortoises, and suggests that they develop their claws in order to dig in the sand. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Mr. Hall will focus on the competing hypothesis that sauropod claws evolved to allow them to grip the sand as they walked. Now, back to the talk.
So part 2, we're going to talk about tracks and traces. And this is something that's really cool because everybody can probably picture a Tyrannosaurus rex in their head, or a dinosaur skeleton of some kind, or a woolly mammoth, or a saber-toothed cat. And there is a whole field of paleontology that's hanging out right under our noses, quite literally. It's called ichnology, or paleoichnology. And paleoichnology is the study of tracks and traces left by animals that are long extinct. And it's so cool that you can just go out, even here in Ohio, you can find evidence from the Devonian, long before the dinosaurs, of animals living and thriving in sea mud, you know, over or under what used to, well, under what is now Cleveland, what used to be an ocean or a nearshore environment. And so, you know, these things are behaviors preserved in stone, and I'm going to talk about a few examples. So when we submitted an abstract, or essentially, you know, an application to be part of this book, there were a couple of things. So, you know, these authors wanted to write a book that wasn't your typical, I went out to a footprint site and then I took out my meter stick and I measured the distance between the footprints, and then I calculated and crunched some numbers to get a velocity, and I measured how far apart the legs were and tried to figure out what animal it was based on that. And so that's been done a lot, and it's useful science, but they were going for a bit of a different approach with this book. They wanted to adapt maybe some more technological aspects of it. And so a couple of their criteria were they wanted, you know, tracks to be looked at for more than just being a hole in the ground. You know, there's a lot going on when an animal sticks its foot into a soft substrate. There's very dynamic interactions happening with mass and the speed of movement and what's going on. And then the other thing is, you know, looking at these things not as just like you put your foot in a piece of paper and did a chalk outline, or perhaps did a hand turkey in elementary school, like I know I did, but looking at them as three-dimensional and therefore, you know, really complicated structures. So that is where we thought we fit in, and we didn't ourselves do anything terribly technological other than use the internet and send some emails. But the way that we were looking at dinosaur tracks in this case warranted inclusion, and we were really happy to be part of that. So really what we wanted to address was this thing called plantar flexion. And, you know, plantar flexion, basically squeeze your toes down. That's plantar flexion. That's what we're talking about with these sauropods. And the question, so if this behavior, if this adaptation is used for hanging onto the substrate in the ground, can we find evidence of this interaction in the fossil record? And that's where trace fossils come in, because what we're talking about is a behavior, okay? Even just walking around on the beach, just looking for seashells, that's a behavior. In some places, you know, maybe your footprints could be found in a couple million years preserved. And, you know, maybe you don't have to be thinking about much at the time to leave an impression. But in a lot of cases, you can infer some really interesting behaviors from trace fossils. So bite marks are one of my favorites. So you see the puncture holes in the skull of that Dunkleosteus. You know, something bit that animal in the head, and we have examples of that here in Cleveland. You can find gnaw marks on bones made not just by the killing predator, but by scavengers. Rodents love to chew on bone as a source of calcium and to work down their teeth. Nests are considered a trace fossil. The eggs inside the nests not, but the nests themselves are a trace. So that's where we talk a little bit about excavating, you know, with the hind limbs. Some of the other real popular trace fossils are coprolites. Raise your hand if you know what a coprolite is. Well, it is right before dinner, let's have a conversation about fossil feces. Because yes, even that fossilizes, you'd be surprised. And if everyone can see, there's a little smiley face shape in the top of that coprolite. That's where a shark decided to bite it and see what exactly it was. So you can even have bite marks in fossil feces, which is really fun. And coprolites are very informative because if you open them up, Evidence of an animal's last meal will be in there. You can find fish scales and bones, or wood and plant materials inside. Muscle tissue has even been found. So those are actually very informative. And then burrows, as you can see, lots of things leave burrows, from tortoises to shrimp to little worm-like animals. Like this is a burrow called thalassinoides. Now the animal itself, if we knew what animal made those, wouldn't happen. And that's the interesting thing about when you study trace fossils and paleoichnology. The trace fossils have a special nomenclature separate from the actual animals. So if a Brachiosaurus or a Diplodocus, a big sauropod, makes a footprint, we actually don't know which species makes the footprints, because it can be kind of vague. So we name the footprints things like, Brontopodus or Thunderfoot, which is kind of cool. And so there's a whole distinct nomenclature. But the important takeaway here is that these fossils are direct evidence of behavior that we can observe from the fossil record. And footprints are no exception. And this is a slab, I think, from St. George in southwestern Utah. So how do footprints get preserved in the fossil record? Where do we go to find these? Well, you got to go find rocks of the right age that are eroding, and you got to go find sediments that are associated with moving water. These diagrams show you a river system, or a couple different river types. But if you have a lake shore, if you have a tidal flat, where the water comes in and out occasionally, those are places where, wherever there's mud and water moving, you can get footprints. Here you can see in the image there are some dinosaurs moving across various environments, and an animal moving through the moving water in a river channel, you're not going to get footprints preserved there, because usually rivers are they're eroding and they're scouring. But if you're up over the banks in the floodplain and there's mud, that's where the chances increase. Or if you're along the shore of a lake and you get a big storm and the water levels rise, you have a better chance. Or walking through the shallows. And when we look at it from sort of a play-by-play breakdown, essentially you have dinosaur steps into some mud and removes the foot and leaves an impression of some kind. Depending on how wet the mud is, you can have prints that are just kind of messy potholes, or you can have prints that preserve every fine detail of every scale on the foot. And then water flows in carrying a bunch of sediment, sand, or mud, and it fills and buries that track. And then it's all buried and turned into stone and lithified. And fast forward to however many millions of years later, and you can get two different fossils from that one act. Okay, so this footprint produces a part and a counterpart. So you get the actual footprint, which is the natural mold of an animal's foot impression, but then sometimes the infill will be so well preserved that if that pops out, you can actually find what is essentially a replica of the foot of the animal that was making those prints. So 2-for-1 deal is pretty good, in my opinion. One of the most amazing fossil track sites is in Bolivia, and we didn't actually have any specimens from this locality, but I have to show you this just so you understand. One animal can leave thousands and thousands of fossils behind, aside from a skeleton, just walking around. And at Orcko, what you have here is a limestone quarry from a nearshore kind of marine environment, where when the rocks were tilted up by mountain building, a mining company came through and was stripping off layers of the rock, and suddenly these massive slabs appeared full of dinosaur tracks, and some of these trackways are hundreds and hundreds of feet long. So in this photo, you can see on the upper left there's a dinosaur trackway that's about 400 feet long that's marching up what is now a 300-foot high cliff. And this whole site is 2,300 meters long, almost 2.5 kilometers long, and 300 feet high. And there's more than 5,000 dinosaur tracks preserved here. So it's a sight to behold. And now that you all have been wowed by the majesty of Orcko, we're going to talk about one of the localities we used in our study, which is Dinosaur Valley, Texas. It actually is a trackway site that is underwater part of the year, under the Paluxy River. And in this photo, you can see this child is sitting in the footprint of a big sauropod dinosaur taking a bath. It's kind of a famous picture, but it really warrants inclusion here because it turns out not much changes over time. You know, people are still sitting in the footprints. So we looked at several different track sites, you know, for our study, but this one I think is pretty relatable because it's from the US and it's actually pretty famous. There's been a lot of work done on it, and we have many of our specimens in our data set came from here. And part of the reason is because, well, there's a lot of tracks there, but we need some specific things with our tracks. This is an example of one footprint. You're actually looking at it from the heel, and I think you can see the holes that the toes made in the sediment. And then there looks to be a meter stick there, so that's just probably under about 2.5 foot long footprint. It's fairly sizable. You could stick your foot down into each of those toe holes. And what's really cool is that if you take a print like that, and if you paint a whole bunch of latex or liquid rubber in there, you can pop it out. And what you wind up with is a relief, or essentially a cast of the foot of the animal that made this. So you can see from that they pulled a mold, and that turned out to look just like the foot of a sauropod dinosaur. You can see 3 pretty big claws poking up there, and you can also see 2 sort of accessory nubs where the 4th and 5th digits would have been, and notice how bulbous the edge of that footprint that is facing you. It's very thick and it's rounded, so there was a very healthy fatty pad at the back of the foot. Some of the other neat things from this locality, here's a photo composite from Jim Farlow, who was gracious enough to send many photos. He's worked the site for many years. And what you can see here is a trackway where there are big round sauropod footprints, and then stepping right on them or behind them are 3-toed meat-eating dinosaur footprints. And this is from a trackway where they think the big plant eater was being pursued by the big meat eater, which is one really cool indication of a potential predator-prey interaction in the fossil record. A couple of the other areas, this was called the Blue Hole Ballroom. Every pockmark in that picture in front of that researcher is a footprint of some kind. So you can see sometimes it takes an eye to sort of see it, but there's big sauropod prints and lots of meat-eating dinosaur prints in there as well. And you know, to pull it all together, tracks are important because they tell us tales directly. You know, you look at skeletons, you wonder, man, I wonder what it was like, I wonder how it lived, I wonder how fast it ran. You can figure that out by looking at basically what may amount to holes in rock until you have the background and the context to understand them. So, you know, yeah, we can learn about speed, we can watch animals walk and turn and do all kinds of stuff. There's fossil prints of animals that sat in the mud or slipped and slided around. You can see traces of crocodiles crawling on banks of rivers. All kinds of really neat things. We also get an anatomical information, soft tissue, skin, you know, the claw covers. How did that look in these living animals? Because, you know, you can make so many informed assumptions based on anatomy, but when you actually have the evidence in the sediment, you know, then you're actually doing something. And then the diversity. So when you have a giant trackway area, you're getting lots of different animals, and not just dinosaurs. You can get mammal tracks, you can get amphibian tracks, you can get other kinds of reptiles, you can get birds. So you can construct whole ecosystems even if you don't have a single bone from a single skeleton. And then, as you saw a moment ago, behavior interactions, predator-prey relationships, herding, you know, the structure of herds, you know, do you have adults and juveniles or just adults? Are they solitary? So there's a lot of really, really good information that we've got.
In the picture you had of Dunkleosteus and something had bit it, I thought that they were armor-plated fish. Aren't they armor-plated?
Yes, so Dunkleosteus belongs to a group of extinct fish called placoderms, and that name means plate skin, and they are often referred to as the armored fish. And when you look at them, it's hard not to think of it that way. And in some select members of that group, I think that, you know, the bony plates would have functioned well as an anti-predator, you know, sort of adaptation. But those bones are the skull bones, and so there's a bit of a misunderstanding sometimes, because when you, to call them purely armor would be like taking all the skin off of our skulls and saying we have armor plating on our heads too. Those are the actual skulls of the animals. So in Dunkleosteus, the bones are really quite thick, but they would have been covered in connective tissue. So you have ligaments and things holding the bones together, and then you have skin covering that as well. Maybe not a lot of muscle tissue there, but they definitely would have had soft tissue over that skull. And so when you see holes in those bones, that's really cool, because that Dunkleosteus skull that you saw was somewhere probably between 3 and 4 feet long. So something with an even bigger mouth had to go chomping down on it. Probably, you know, in the ecosystems where they're preserved, they are the biggest predator. So it may have been another Dunkleosteus biting down on it, which is kind of cool. Whether to eat it or just to tell it to go away, I don't know.
Can you tell us anything about the speed of the locomotion?
Can I tell you anything about the speed of locomotion in sauropod dinosaurs in particular? Yeah, so they were not sprinters. You know, they could get along. And the thing about it is that if you were to take your normal stride, you know, you'll get across the room, and you know it'll take you a second or two. But if you were to stand on stilts and then take that same stride using the stilts, you'd get across the room in half the time, because your stride length is greatly increased. So sauropods didn't necessarily have to go running around, because they had legs that were longer than, you know, 2 of me tall. So they could really move a lot, and they didn't have to use too much energy to use it. Now, you know, if suddenly an Acrocanthosaurus comes snapping at their hindquarters, and maybe they could get into a trot, but you know, yeah. So you know, they were not breaking any speed records.
I saw an image that you had put up there of tracks that were kind of, the images were stitched together. Do you use a lot of like drone, not necessarily you, but this kind of work, drone images and photogrammetry to get like a 3-dimensional, you know, try to capture those tracks?
So personally, I have not used drone photography or photogrammetry, but that is absolutely being done. There are researchers who, and it works great, because when you have an area the size of this room covered in hundreds of footprints, now you can do photogrammetry with drones. Who here is familiar with photogrammetry? Who's heard that expression? Yeah, okay. Photogrammetry is really cool. So now we have computer algorithms that are capable of, so if I wanted to get a 3-dimensional model, color model of, say, this area where the computer is up here, I could take out a camera and I could step around this area and I could take a picture from a few different angles. You know, maybe take like 5 pictures, then I'd move and end up with, you know, 300 or 400 photos. Upload that into a computer and tell the computer stitch them together, and it can recognize the depths and distances of the objects and turn that into a 3-dimensional model within the computer. And then you can spit it out in a 3D printer and make a little model of this. But it's important when you're dealing with things like dinosaur track sites, because you can essentially fly a camera and a drone around an area like this room and take photos all over, put them into a computer, and suddenly you've got a 3-dimensional model accurate down to, I don't know, like maybe the centimeter level, that allows you then to, if you put a meter stick on the ground, you can tell the computer, once you've got your 3D model, this little thing is 1 meter long, and then you can measure in your computer. You don't even have to measure out on site. So yeah, that's absolutely being done.
Not exactly a question about their feet, but do you know what they ate?
They ate lots of different things. Actually, sauropod skulls can vary. Some of them are, you know, big. Some of them are about the size of a horse. It depends on, you know, which animal. But really, if you look at the teeth, sauropods have a few different kinds of tooth morphologies. One of them is a spatulate tooth morphology, where, I mean, you think of the word spatula, you think of spoon. It's because the teeth are spoon-shaped. They have a slight hook to them, but they're just big, fat, kind of rounded, blunt teeth, which would have been good for basically browsing on tough conifer trees and things at a higher level. Then you had some sauropods where the teeth just looked like pencils sticking out of the mouth. They were very peg-like and not terribly tightly fit together, so there was some room. They could have done quite a bit of grazing with those and raking it in. And people wonder, how did sauropods eat? How did they survive? They're so big. Well, their necks were really biomechanical wonders because they had all of these bony rods that went along the length of some of the vertebrae, and that combined with the ligaments and tendons meant that when a sauropod would twitch its neck muscles to the left, the head would swing over and it could just chomp, 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 chomp. And then that stored kinetic energy in the ossified tendons of the neck. So then it could just kind of relax its neck muscles and the neck would swing back, chomp, 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 and then it could pick it up with the muscles pulling the other way. So they were just kind of going back and forth. And you walk a few steps and you just eat. So they're just tick-tocking across, kind of like that's what I think of. Yeah.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Lee Hall. Mr. Hall is Preparador of Vertebrate Paleontology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. He has excavated Troodon nests from Montana, megalodon teeth from beneath the streets of Los Angeles, sea caves in Alaska, and late Cretaceous dinosaurs in southern Alberta, Canada. In the second part of our talk, we discussed how dinosaur tracks teach us about the animals that made them. In our final segment, Mr. Hall will talk about looking for evidence that sauropods grip the dirt. Now, back to our talk.
Okay, so I thank you. The middle part of any presentation like this is always a bit of a slog because there's a lot of background information, new things, are coming through, a lot of these weird terms, but this is going to be the payoff. This is where it gets really cool. So, stepping back in time, we're going to talk about what we actually learned when we applied ichnology to this study. So the substrate grip hypothesis can be broken down into basically, the claws are holding onto the ground to generate traction to help with propulsion. And it had actually been mentioned that perhaps this was also useful in something called miring avoidance, or not getting stuck in the mud and dying like these poor sauropods are doing here. There might be some fossil evidence to indicate we have a site or two around the world where we only have sauropod feet upright in the mud. And the rest of it's gone. So, maybe they were getting stuck every once in a while. That obviously wasn't helping them. But you also have something called post-holing. So when you imagine taking a fence post and jamming it down into the mud, or if you yourself have ever gotten thigh deep stuck in mud, gravity makes it real easy to go down, but it's real hard to get back up, especially because as you move your leg up or try to remove a long object from mud, you have a very strong vacuum force that is working against you. So it might be that maybe these claws were helping by scouring into the mud to avoid, that suction and to provide air channels. So here's what we're going to look at. We're actually going to talk about this miring avoidance. So, miring avoidance means mud is bad. So we should be looking for evidence of flexion being engaged in the claws in muddy environments. And wouldn't you know it, mud is also really good for preserving dinosaur tracks. So let's take a look. The first thing we needed to do was come up with a hypothetical model to compare track morphologies. So on the left you have sort of a sauropod foot in a neutral position, and then below that you have a typical footprint with the claws slightly extended. That's kind of your typical really well-preserved sauropod track. And on the right is an illustration depicting the sauropod foot with those claws flexed and kind of folding down. It's a really tricky thing to draw. I tried several times and that's about the best I could do, but essentially if you can imagine all those claws overlapping and forming a scraper at the front of the foot, what would that leave as an impression when something squished down into the mud? So the drawing below that is an attempt to show we're looking for maybe some scour lines and especially a deep pocket at the front of the footprint. You should see a trough at the front of the footprint that's about 2 feet, 3 feet wide, where this animal had dug its toes in to help push it along. We also needed to look for well-preserved tracks. Well-preserved dinosaur tracks have a few key features. They've got some relief. I'll outline this one here. You can see anatomical features of the individual toes and the claws, and in some cases you can even get impressions from the skin. And so what we did is we searched through the literature. We went through dozens and dozens and dozens of papers. Any paper that mentioned sauropods and footprints, we looked in their figures. And wouldn't you know it, scientists, we often don't do a very good job of putting in great pictures, but when we saw that there was maybe hope of a good specimen, we would send an email to the person who wrote that paper and say, hey, we're doing this study. We can't afford to travel to 4 different countries. Do you have better, clear photos of your specimens from this research paper that you would mind emailing us, and we would thank you as an acknowledgement? And quite a few people said, sure. So we got responses from, well, you can see we have the UK, so we had Portugal, and we had Switzerland, and we had England, and we had Morocco, and then here in the States. So we had a pretty good sweep on 3 continents. And in the end, we came away with 33 or 34 different specimens from, you know, several different track sites. So this is a list. Don't try and read it. I just wanted to prove that we had done it, and I'm not just making things up, but there's our list of 33 or 34 dinosaur tracks that were really well preserved, along with information about what geologic unit and what country, blah, blah, blah. And when you get all these emails and all these pictures, it's great. Now you got to start going through all of these tracks and footprints and making some sense out of them. And so how, you know, when you've got some that are kind of, you know, well preserved and some that are part of bigger assemblages, some of them are a little murky, you know, how do you pull useful information out of there? So what we started with was, you know, the criteria that I had outlined earlier. And the other thing was, there's a few different ways that prints can get preserved. So like I mentioned earlier, you can get the impression left by the foot, or sometimes you can get a positive relief in the shape from the foot that popped out of that hole. And in this case on the right, we actually did get a little bit of LiDAR data. So essentially using radar to scan the surface of a track to give you depth information. And if you look at the 2 tracks on the left, you'll see that they're fairly shallowly emplaced into that sediment. So it was muddy, but the mud wasn't too soft. It was, you know, there was hard pack underneath. They went down maybe about 10 centimeters or, you know, 3 or 4 inches or so. And on the right is an example from Glen Rose in Texas, where that is probably 2 or 3 times the depth. And the darker coloration is deeper in the mud. So if you look at those, the hind foot is the kind of the depression on the left, and you can see in both of those C and D images, it's the midline, sort of the interior, what we would call our arch. That portion of the foot is what is most deeply emplaced in the mud. And that is actually the case in many, many, many of these trackways. So we actually were able to figure out where the mass of the animal was going. And the reason that's important is because if you are worried about getting stuck, and if you're going to start driving your legs to get you out of the mud, you're going to start digging those claws in, you're going to see a very deep signature. You know, that's a lot of your mass and pressure is going into the toes, and we don't see that here. So that's one thing to take away. In another instance, we had colleagues in Portugal who had footprints that had scales and skin preserved in them. So what you're looking at there, you can see the fingers on the left. There are tubercles and warty bumps and scales that range in size from a quarter to a plum. So there's a very rough and a rugged surface on the bottom of the foot. So sauropods actually, their skin is much like the tread of a hiking boot. They've actually got all these little furrows and nooks and crannies and things. And so that was very exciting to find as well. These are examples of some, well, all except the top left are natural molds. So those are instances where we don't have the original hole left in the ground, but we have the sort of the natural copy of the bottom of the foot. And on the upper left, that's a man-made mold. So you can see there's a couple of sauropod prints, and one thing that they all have in common is you can see the claws very clearly. They are all separated by several inches, and they're held in sort of that neutral sauropod claw position where the toes kind of point out towards the outside of the body. And you know, these come from Texas and Arizona, and then the 3 on the bottom and the right are from the UK, from I believe the Isle of Wight, which is part of what's called the Jurassic Coast. When we zoom in on one of the Texas specimens, this is really interesting because this is a foot that's stuck in the mud fairly deeply. And those toes are actually, they're kind of spreading out. This was something we didn't actually expect. So this is an instance where the foot's not really in a neutral position, but those toes actually look like they're really just feeling out, sticking out into the mud, like almost like the foot is being somewhat extended. And here's another better close-up of one of the English tracks where you can see the claws really just kind of hanging out. They're not, they're not extended at all, but they're certainly not full, overlapped and folded down as plantar flexion would have them be. So what that comes down to is when you look at the model we created, as we created it, we were unable to, in our sample size, find any indication of plantar flexion being engaged in these muddy substrates. And these are mud, like I said, from a few inches deep to several inches deep. And actually what we're seeing might be the reverse, where when they get into the mud and the muddy stuff, they're sticking their toes out more. Why, we don't know, but it might be that having those vertical big blade-like claws stuck out into the mud would help prevent sideways slipping. It might, help prevent like torsion or twisting in the limb column, which would be important. So in that case, there certainly may be, adding in some stability. The other thing is we weren't able to look at what happens when a sauropod walks on a sand dune. Maybe that could have been useful for substrate grip. So we're not necessarily ruling substrate grip out at all, but what we are saying is that so far, one of the previously stated hypotheses of getting stuck in the mud is probably not the best explanation for this. And so again, what was really interesting, I talked earlier and last time about how sauropod feet are not like elephants. They're not the same thing, except for when you look at the bottom and the underside of the foot. So the big oval on the right-hand side is the bottom of an elephant foot. And so out in nature, they have a kind of a thick callus in the bottom of the foot, and there's rivulets and pits and furrows all through there, and that actually would act as something as a bit of a grip aid, because they don't have claws, but they get around just fine. And that's not necessarily dissimilar to the big scales that you see on the bottom of a sauropod foot. So I'll give them that. I'll give them that. Finally, this is just a figure that I like to point out. So we generated, all of our own artwork for this study, except for a couple of borrowed figures. But that is the foot of an elephant, I believe an African elephant, that was beautifully rendered by Ashley Hall, one of the study's co-authors. And on the far right is the underside of a tortoise foot, where you can see all tortoises also have these cute little column-like scales sticking out of the bottom of the foot, along with those really nice long digging claws. And in the middle, you also have the foot of a sauropod. Now, these are obviously not to scale. That would be one big tortoise. But there you can see the sauropod foot rendered in flexion from sort of an interesting, from the bottom of the foot there, as drawn by myself. So, elephant, sauropod, tortoise, some similarities there, but sauropods are definitely their own thing. And now, hopefully, you will all be able to take this wonderful information you learned about dinosaurs home and repeat all this information for your Thanksgiving dinners on Thursday. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.